Want some awesome merch? Check out www.midtierthoughts.com for all of our awesome t-shirts and stickers. Want to support the podcast while also supporting a pro Second Amendment company? Check out Blackout Coffee with the link down below in the description. Also, use the code also in the description to order from Blackout Coffee and save 20% on your next order. They support the Second Amendment and they support us, so we support them. Check them out below. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Mid-Tier Thoughts. I am joined today by my buddy Pat, and we are going to be talking about spiky boys, stabby boys, the way of the blade. We are talking about knives and such, category I know very little about outside of, they poke things and make you bleed. So we're going to get into the weeds with this, and you guys are going to learn along with me. So with that, Pat, who are you? What do you do?
Sure. For the most part, I spent a little bit of time in the Army, approximately 3 years. Grew up in the woods, hunting, fishing, pretty much digging in the dirt, that kind of thing. First knife I ever got was when I was probably 4 years old, cut myself soon afterwards. So, needless to say, I like knives. That being said, my taste has grown over the years. So we're here to talk about that.
Yeah, I would assume that, much like gun guys, we all start somewhere, and you start, maybe you get into it just to get into it, and you're not like really sure where to start. And then as you kind of learn and develop, you start to realize, like using ARs, for example. When you're brand new into it, you might be like, man, really, what's the difference between a $400, $1,400 and $2,400 AR? Really, what am I getting the difference of, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. And I would imagine knives are the same way.
Oh, absolutely. I always go back to when I got into AR-15s specifically. I kind of harken back to buy once, cry once, because I learned the hard way twice. I bought a cheap Palmetto State build that somebody else had built and put together poorly. And let me tell you, I had to adjust the rear sight all the way to the right, and let me tell you, it still would not zero. It was bad. So I pretty much booted that quickly, picked up an AR pistol from Palmetto State. Once again, not built by myself. This was before I knew anything about AR-15s. And turns out the guy that built it put a pistol buffer spring in a carbine system. Well, when you put a pistol buffer spring in a carbine system, the damn thing doesn't function. It's a single shot rifle. Yeah, no, yeah. It turns into a single shot system. It's a bolt action at that point.
Yeah.
And I learned at that point in my career, hey, buy once, cry once.
Yeah.
It'll come around and bite you in the ass if you don't. So at that point, I punted that crap and I bought a Daniel Defense rifle. So
yeah, I mean, my journey into rifles is very similar to that. Start out with something cheap, learn why. Eventually, you learn why it's cheap, and then eventually you continue to grow. And same, buy once, cry once. I got my Daniel now, and but yeah, so like that's one thing that's like for me is I know I do have a limited knowledge on knives. I've got some friends of mine that are knife guys, and they can geek out about it and tell you all the numbers and the facts and everything about it, and that's just not my thing. So I don't really, it's like you're speaking Chinese to me. You're like, yeah, sure, just tell me which one I need to buy, right? So for the people listening, it's like when you go to the gas station, they got a $12 knife. It's got a tiger on it and a flashlight and everything. And it's like, you know that knife is probably garbage, right? But it's like you don't really know why. You know what I mean? You just know that because it's cheap, it's probably garbage. And then, you go and you might see like a Gerber or like a cheap Spyderco or something for like that 60 to $100 range. And I think for your average person, that's kind of where they can justify spending that money on knives. But I mean, I've got buddies of mine. I mean, I've got like some mini cleavers or some, small, like some really elegant knife stuff. I mean, and they're paying well into, several hundreds. I've seen some YouTube stuff where guys got several $1,000 knives. And
That
for
they're
me, it's one of
carrying
those
every
things.
day.
Yeah, they're carrying it every day. They're using it every day, and it's one of those things for me where it's like, how how do I know the difference? Like just like going to that AR-15 thing and being like, if you were to go to the gun store counter and the guy tells you, this is why this one's $400, this is why this was $1,400. What are the differences you're paying for? Like obviously there's a little bit of quality, but I mean like what are we paying for in those differences? What are like if that does that make sense?
No, sure. So, much like anything else, you're looking at your materials, you're looking at craftsmanship, you're looking at details in your designs. You know, for me, as a user, it really comes down to how does it feel in my hand, obviously. Even if it's a cheap knife, if it's a gas station knife, right? Uh, if it feels okay in my hand and it doesn't have a hot spot after using it for more than 10 minutes, that's not a bad knife, right?
Now, what would you mean by hotspot?
So, for instance, um, on a lot of knives on the handle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, for instance, when you're gripping the knife, if you grip a knife as hard as you can,
Mm-hmm.
right? Over time, working it, you feel the spots that are raised, right?
Okay.
You're going to feel the areas that you're going to feel friction, the points that are going to be more problematic if you're having to use that knife, say for 10, 15 minutes, gutting a deer. You're having to, you know, fillet a fish. Let's
Okay.
say you're, having to feather some sticks, whatever it may be. A lot of knives, especially cheap knives, have a tendency to give you hot spots. And it's going to be on the inner webbing on your fingers, that
Okay.
inner webbing, particularly in spots where you're constantly using it, right?
Yeah. So you're talking about like spots that are just kind of uncomfortably wearing against you, right?
Right, where you could potentially get a blister. Um,
Got it. And then
and if this
just
is
like just
something
like
you're
with
using,
I was gonna say just like with carrying a gun, like if it's uncomfortable for you, you're not going to carry it. And if you've got this cheap knife that's giving you these that's uncomfortable to use, you're not going to use it. You're not going to carry it. You're not going to want to use it.
exactly. A lot of knives, one of the things that I see that's incredibly popular right now is like an exposed hilt, I guess, to be a glass breaker point, right?
Oh yeah.
Which is great,
Yeah.
you know, um, in some senses. In the sense of that's a rubbing point on your skin,
Yeah.
potentially, or in your pocket, especially on fixed blades. They do that crap, right? And on a fixed blade, if it's not rounded off, if it's not beveled correctly, that is going to rub
Hmm.
on your skin and you will never carry that.
Yeah.
It's just a
Yeah. That's
fact.
a good point.
The fit and finish, when it comes down to the actual materials. So, and we're going to talk about blade steels here in a minute, and we'll get a little bit into that. We're not going to get too nerdy about it. I'll give you a few charts later from knife steel nerds. I'll be honest with you. 90% of my knowledge comes from Laren Thomas over at Knife Steel Nerds. He's a great resource for really anything related to um, blade steels, knife steels, any of that stuff. That's where I've learned an incredible amount of my knowledge. In fact, I've got a couple of books I can recommend if you're interested at the end of the podcast. But
sweet, yeah, we'll get to that.
When it comes to say your gas station knives, your $16 knives, your $60 knives, what you're going to see the differences are. You're going to see craftsmanship that is slightly worse. You're going to see pieces that are not fitted correctly, things that are not beveled quite as nicely as you would on, say, a higher dollar knife, right? And then say you get up to that $60 knife range, okay? The $60 knife range is what, like you said, most every person is comfortable spending on a knife, because quite frankly, most everyone is going to occasionally lose a pocket knife,
right? Or use it as a pry bar, or do something
hand
to
it
it that
off to someone.
Yeah.
So I will say, one of the things that you will not see a whole lot of in my I guess collection, my what I've got hanging around right now, is a whole lot of folding knives. Currently, I think I have one and it's in storage somewhere. But the reason for that is I just don't prefer folding knives. I never really have. I've got probably 10 total, and several of them are like heirlooms and things that are, passed down to me. It's just
Any
not my
particular
thing.
reason? Is there a preference for? Is it just like you just don't prefer them, just like because, or is there more of a reason behind that, or?
So for me, it's never been my preference to carry a folder. But then I've also been in circumstances where I've watched people use them as pry bars and things that they weren't intended to be used for, and then they inevitably fail. Um,
Right.
and then, quite frankly, I would rather just have a fixed blade knife where I could beat on it, and if it fails, the steel has failed. Right?
Okay.
We
Yeah.
we have a greater problem here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
if and quite frankly, you can clean up an edge. You can, unless you have had a catastrophic failure in the metal, you can clean up an edge. You can fix something. I mean, even if you do not personally have a sharpening system of your own, you can send it off to someone to have that edge fixed. So, me personally, I've never seen a folding knife, even when it comes to, you can talk about Benchmade, you can talk about Chris Reeve all you want to. There's some really nice, really high-end folders out there. Not one of them is stronger than a fixed blade knife.
Now, with that, I mean, is that just because, like, the obvious, like, the fact that you've got a leverage point with with it being on a bearing, or with it being like, on a, I'm trying to think of the word, but on a thing that flips it out, like, because you have that leverage point, is that why?
Right. Obviously, you're looking at a piece of steel that is on a bearing. Now, granted, when you're looking at a company, say like Benchmade, they have probably done, and I use them as an example because they probably done the best job at doing the internal locking liner, that is just super strong, and it's almost negligible as far as weight. But that being said, you look at Chris Reeve, who charges, that company, and I hate to say this, I'm going to badmouth a couple of companies because they
That's what we
charge way
do
too
here.
much.
That's what we
Yeah,
do here.
they charge way too much. So I am going to be a little blunt in regards to a couple of companies in the knife industry, and I'll be the first to tell you, knife people, are 10 times worse than gun people in regards to their cult-like following of a company or a brand. And I do mean cult-like following of a company or brand. And if you get into knife communities or knife groups on Facebook for very long, you'll figure that out. I don't have to name many names, but you'll figure it out quickly. So, like I said, companies like Chris Reeve, they are the originators of that liner lock design, okay? They are the perfecters of that liner lock design. However, I believe it was when they came out with their newest design, the newest Sabenzas, they switched out their older steel ball bearing for a ceramic ball bearing. And when they moved to the ceramic ball bearing, the blade became wobbly. It doesn't matter which model you get, which blade steel, what have you. If you own a Sabenza 31, it's going to be wobbly blade. And for a $600 to $900 pocket knife, if I had a wobbly blade, I would be very angry.
Yeah, I mean that seems like if you spend that kind of money, that knife better be, the best thing you've ever had.
No, the company that sells at that price, and they can claim that that is the fair market asking value, and that is the demand behind their knives, and that's what the asking price is, because that is what the company's representative says. They can say that all they want to, but they should be ashamed for selling at that rate for what that is. I digress. Now,
So I mean, with that real quick, I just want to ask, like,
sure,
I know there's a lot of talk, like in the gun community, especially. You look at things like H&K, right? H&K makes some really, really good stuff, but they demand an incredibly high price for a lot of their stuff because of the importations. And then, they've
sure.
got their running joke of like, oh, not for the poors. Would you say that is that a fairly common thing in the knife world that you think of charge, like, one company like you said that charges, like the one you were just talking about, charges a high price, and then everyone else is just like, hey, we could charge $600 for this too. Would you say that that's a fairly common thing?
That is a incredibly common practice in the knife community,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to one company. Let's say we do a certain style of okay, so let me use the example of fixed blades.
Okay.
So for fixed blades, the most common type of like handle material, okay, is probably going to be G10, right?
Yeah.
G10 is an incredibly cheap component to manufacture, to get, what have you. A lot of these companies are taking G10 and putting it on a knife, and then taking the same knife and cerakoting it and putting, a different colored handle on it, and then charging, I don't know, $100 more. It's something obscene like that. One of the things that really annoys me in regards to any fixed blade is that if it's a bolt-on handle, if it has screws in it,
Yeah.
you really shouldn't be charging $600. And I'm seeing a lot of that in the knife community right now. There's one company in particular that their knives are fetching anywhere from hell. $300 to $1,000. And if you go on their site right now, most of those handles are either bolt-on or something of the like. Now, occasionally you can find some of them that are micarta pins or something like G10 pins, which are great, if they're actually pinned and they, take some actual craftsmanship and work. Not to say that the other knives don't take that craftsmanship and work, but when you're bolting on a handle versus taking the time to actually shape one and pin in handles and charging the same price, again, you should be ashamed. But because you put an Indian head on it, you can charge the same price.
Yeah, that's the thing I think that's interesting is I know now granted this is not like that expensive, but when at the gun shop I worked at, we got a knife display and we carried a lot. They sold really well, so we carried a lot of Spydercos, a lot of Civivi knives, Cobra Tac, a few other things in there. But a lot of the Civivi knives, it would be the exact same knife, but one would have just a straight blue handle, then one would have a more artsy looking handle, and it'd be like $40 more. And at least
It would
according to
have
the
the
specs,
mother
to
of
my
pearl inlay.
yeah, and so then it looks, it looks way cooler. It's the same knife and it's $40 more. And it's definitely like it seems like some of the stuff is like, like for me, it's like I don't care how it looks, it's going to be in my pocket and I'm going to beat the crap out of it, right? Some people, it seems like it's definitely more of like the status symbol for your EDC type of deal, almost like a point of pride or a point of like snobbery, to be like, oh, look at you in the pores with your Spyderco, here, look at me and my fancy knife. That's sometimes what it comes across like, being not a knife guy talking to knife guys sometimes, is it's like, oh, you've got a Spyderco in a pocket. What are you, a poor? Look at my $500 custom made, blah blah blah. And that's, I think, speaking from the outside, it definitely sometimes can come across like that. Um, and so sometimes
Well,
I definitely
it
feel like that
100%
kind of
is that.
yeah,
Like, no,
yeah,
no, to be 100% honest, like there are unfortunately way too many people in the community that are that, which, it's a shame. I'll tell you, there are some communities that are weirder than others. Again, it's just like with guns. You mentioned HK fanboys versus, say, another company. It's very much like that. One of the examples that I always see is that some brands are meant to be used and some brands are meant to be looked at. I'll tell you.
I definitely get that vibe from at least from our, even just our knife display counter, that it definitely seems like some are made as like, hey, we know you're going to beat the crap out of this knife. That's why we didn't make it pretty. And other ones are definitely more like, when you take that Instagram photo of your EDC, you're going to look super cool.
Right. And don't get me wrong, like I've got a couple of knives that are in my opinion just pretty.
Yeah.
There is something about them that is just beautiful. And
And,
then there is something very simplistically beautiful about several of them.
And I think that's one thing too, is like, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with collecting something like that because it looks cool or it's pretty or anything like that. Because, some people do that with guns. I mean, like I do that with milsurps, right? With military surplus rifles. Like for me, it's a historical thing and I like the way they look, and it's not a practicality point. Like I'm not going to go defend my house with some weird Argentine Mauser caliber, but it looks really cool and it's got some little notes to it. And so I think that that's one thing I definitely see that too with the knives, is that like in some ways it's almost more to like you are carrying a work of art that it can also be used as a tool depending on what it is.
Absolutely. And I will say, like for example, I absolutely love Winkler knives, but I live in Hawaii, and high carbon steel does not like Hawaii. And Winkler knives are made of a high carbon steel, which is
Mm.
specifically 80 CRV2. And you know, in my opinion, there's nothing more beautiful than one of these knives, and also, quite frankly, from a user standpoint, 80 CRV2. Granted, it's a cheap tool steel, um, but it'll keep an edge, and it's hard as shit.
So speaking of keeping an edge with that, when it comes to like sharpening knives, when it that's I feel like it's one of those things where you kind of got to know what you're doing a little bit, because I mean, like, you can go down to just about any store and buy like a cheap knife sharpener, that where it's got like it's a little bit bigger than the size it's like a little bit bigger than the size of your thumb, and it's got like the little V cut in there, the little V ceramic thing, and then looks like a little spike that's all edged, and it's like, I gotta get it. I'm not a knife guy, but I feel like looking at that, like, that's like
Oh yeah,
the hype.
the old school work sharp V sharp, man.
Yeah,
Those are
exactly.
classic.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've seen that, or I've seen, like, the stone and the stone and the lubricant, or the stone and the oil. I
Uh-huh.
mean,
The
it
stuff that
it
your
seems
grandpappy
like,
used.
exactly. I mean, it seems like when it comes to that kind of stuff, that it's like, if you don't know what you're doing, you're gonna fuck your knife up really fast.
Okay, so I'll be completely honest with you. You will. uh,
Yeah.
but when it comes to all things, especially with an edge, you can always fix it. But just like we talked about in the very beginning of the podcast, when you buy once and cry once, you usually end up a little bit better, right? Now,
Right.
I'm not telling you you have to go out and spend, you know, $1,000 on a Wicked Edge Pro system, okay? Because there are those people that are in that type of a position who will go out and buy those systems, right? But
Mhm.
nobody does that for their first system, right? Nobody
Right.
goes out and buys $1,000 system. People go out and they go buy a Work Sharp. Okay, they buy a Work Sharp Precision Adjust. Okay, the Work Sharp Precision Adjust is probably the best out of the box sharpener, right? Because it's, I don't know, $100 online. You can check Amazon right now, and you could probably find those systems for around $100. You can get lapping films for those. Lapping films are essentially just these um, microfilm lube type deals that go across the stones that are attached to the system. But they can allow you to get a pretty much mirror edge polish on your knives. Now, on a $100 system, getting a mirror edge polish, that's pretty impressive. You could also upgrade. You could go to, say, something like a Work Sharp Professional Precision Adjust. That's what I have. I have the Hapstone attachment, which is something that is not sold by Work Sharp. That is something that is sold by a company called Gritomatic. Gritomatic is one of the best knife supply stores in the country. They're all online. They're out of Georgia. They're a great company. I kind of rep them anytime I can. But they sell the Hapstone attachment, which allows me to use any sort of stone that I would like to on my Work Sharp system. So I don't have to use Work Sharp stones. I can use Russian stones such as Venev. I can use Hapstone stones. I can use whatever I would like to. But I use Venev stones, which are Russian. They're, pretty expensive, but they're some of the best. I also use an Axe Cube digital inclometer, which is, typically just so I can have a pretty precise angle. That's probably the biggest thing that I had to learn was if your angle's off, your blade is going to be off. Obviously, that is a big issue. But when it comes to getting into knives, I will say getting a reasonable sharpening system is probably your best upgrade and best investment when getting into any sort of serious knives hobby anyway.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect of that because I think like for most people, right? Like your average person who's not a huge knife guy. He buys a knife because he thinks it's cool, or he needs it for work, or he wants to have a knife for his EDC, whatever. I think your average knife guy either doesn't know how to sharpen a knife, or he just gives it to his buddy who does, or goes out and buys that cheap Walmart thing and runs it through there a couple times like he's sharpening a kitchen knife, you know. Um, and is like good to go. That's what they're thinking in their head. And I think that that's one of those things is like, especially if you're going to do, like you said, and buy once, cry once, if I'm going to spend several $100s on a knife, right, that I'm going to hopefully trust my life to and utilize in a variety of ways, like I should probably know how to take care of that, and I think there was something you mentioned earlier about being in Hawaii that I didn't think about was also knowing a little bit about your environment and the different how the different blade types or as far as like the material wise would react in that environment, because that's something I didn't think of either, about like, oh hey, high carbon steel, you're in a very moist area, not a great combo. And kind of utilizing that knowledge to kind of figure out like, hey, if I do decide to go with that, what precautions do I need to take? Because again, you're spending, if you're spending a ton of money on a knife, right, subjectively a ton of money, but you should probably want to.
Well, I'll say this: there are absolutely people that are spending uh, the amount of money on a knife that they would spend on a handgun. Um, I mean, I've spent $300 on a knife. You can buy a $300 handgun all day long. Why would you not have the tools to maintain that? I mean, I think that's just kind of irresponsible. I mean, to me.
So yeah, I would imagine that, like, you're spending what I think is objectively a lot of money. You'd want to protect your investment, and you'd want to kind of utilize your knowledge of like your area where you're at to, and then kind of learn like, hey, certain types of blade steel or certain types of metal that this may be made out of, might not react very well to where I'm at. Maybe I'm in an area that's very humid, and prone to make things rust. Maybe I need to get something that is, made for that.
No, absolutely. Living in Hawaii, I'll be honest with you, is sort of the reason why I got into knives. Me as a gun guy living in sort of California Junior has kind of been a bummer. So I had to get a new hobby. Knives kind of became that new hobby. So that being said, also getting into that new hobby, I had to learn some little quirks about that new hobby. So, for instance, one of the first blades that I owned when I came out here was made out of 1095. 1095 is kind of a milder stainless. Nothing, crazy, but it is supposed to be, somewhat protected from, the elements. It is going to have, some alloys to, protect it from corrosion. And I'll tell you, it absolutely just was destroyed, uh, probably by my first field exercise uh, out here. So I had to learn pretty quickly, hey, maybe it's time to move to something else. So as I, kind of got into other knives, one of the first other blades that I purchased, or actually, excuse me, I didn't purchase this. This was given to me as a retirement gift from my wife. She gave me a half-face blades Featherlight. This is the only half-face blades knife I own, and I will say, it's a wonderful knife. I love the size of this knife. It's probably the perfect size to EDC, and it's a great design. I don't really care necessarily for what their company goes for these days, but yeah, that's cool. But this knife is made out of S35. So S35 is going to be more of a better steel for the elements. It is a stainless. It is going to be more resistant to the elements, but it is a pretty common steel that you see in most knives these days. S35 is something that you see in folders. It's something that you can see in a lot of knives pretty widely. Between S30V, between S90V and D2, those are some of the most common steels that I would say are higher end that you see in a lot of folders these days from things like Spyderco, Benchmade, that kind of thing. And those are not bad steels. Any of those steels that I mentioned are not bad. Even D2, people kind of talk down on D2. D2 is not a bad steel. It's a older steel as far as it's not as popular anymore now that a lot of the super steels and the high alloy steels and high speed steels have become popular, but D2 still works. Okay. It's going to be cheaper than a lot of the knives that you see in S35. It's going to be cheaper than a lot of the knives that you see that are in 3V, that are in, MagnaCut. MagnaCut is probably the new hotness right now. I will say I am absolutely on that train. So if you want to talk about that, we can talk about that a little bit. MagnaCut is it was designed by Laren Thomas. It was, from what I understand, the only knife steel to be designed specifically for knives. It is a powder steel, just like a lot of the high alloy and high speed steels that are pretty popular these days. Now, cool thing about MagnaCut is that it kind of is almost the, I would say, best of all worlds. Almost. I would say almost. It is very corrosion resistant. From what I can tell in my use, I really have kind of abused all of my pieces that are in MagnaCut. I haven't oiled them at all just because I kind of wanted to see if they would actually rust. And I have a piece from Bradford. It is a Guardian 3.5 in their Nimbus finish. And let me tell you something. Bradford currently has their MagnaCut Guardian 3.5s in stock. And if you're looking for a everyday carry knife and you happen to have the coin, I would absolutely recommend that one. It's a great fixed blade. It's one of my favorites. Now this one, the difference between this one and my knives from Dagger and Knot is going to be the Rockwell hardness. So theoretically, the Rockwell hardness on this Bradford Guardian is going to be somewhere around 61 to 62 versus on this dagger and knot is supposed to be around 63, 64, theoretically. Now, they test these in batches. So when I say the Rockwell hardnesses are supposed to be what they're supposed to be, you know, it is what it is. But I haven't seen any great difference in the two hardnesses as far as like if one of them has rusted, if one of them has had any difference in performance and how one sharpens versus another, anything of that nature. A lot of times people can really get in the weeds, really get into the small nuances when it comes to blade steels. And that's great. That's cool. KnifeSteelNerds.com. There's all kinds of videos, stats, details, all kinds of sorts of things, right? But that being said, there's really no reason to, when quite frankly, all my question is, does it work?
Right, right. One thing I was thinking about too, as we were talking about this, is being a knife guy. I can imagine your frustration with this topic. It seems to me that we already know like gun laws across the United States are a patchwork of anything goes, from being super restrictive in places like California and New York to being all holds bar, even to being like do whatever you want in places like where I live in Idaho or Wyoming or in certain parts of the country. But even in like very gun friendly states, it seems like the knife laws in those areas, that one, a lot of people don't really know about them, and two, that they can get extremely complicated and dumb very quickly. Like I know, when I lived in Washington, I believe correctly, if I remember correctly, like if you had a knife that was over a 3.5 inch blade, I think that it would be considered a concealed weapon. And so
Yes.
that had to be covered. Like that's why we had a concealed weapons permit, not a concealed pistol permit, in Washington State. And so, what has kind of been, like, is there like a USCCA map, like a knife version of that's out there? Like how, or like what's your experience with that kind of stuff been?
So I'll be honest with you. Um, when it comes to like state knife laws and stuff like that, the best resource you have is the American Knife and Tool Institute. They can really give you the lowdown as far as state to state, what the lowdown is, as far as from where you're at. Now, I'll say for me, I've only lived in Alabama, Hawaii, and for a short time, Georgia, which is very, very different, right?
Yeah.
In Alabama, it's kind of like all, no holds barred. Whereas Hawaii, I'll say they're surprisingly non-restrictive on most fixed blades as long as it's not double-edged, right?
Okay.
If it's a dagger or a dirk, as it is referred to in their state laws, Hawaii refers to it as a dirk. Specifically, I believe because of a crime that happened in the 50s.
Hmm.
But yeah, don't know why. They just have a real bad thing against daggers. Um, to me personally, I'm not a dagger guy. I don't own a dagger. Never really intend to. Not even for like display purposes. But hey, to each their own. But I will say, check out, like I said, the American Knife and Tool Institute. They're a great resource. They've got a state map, kind of clickable deal where you can go state by state and it'll tell you exactly what your concealed carry factors are by, each category, whether that's long gun, they even have, pistols, that kind of thing, and then it goes into knife blades, even into, if you're into like batons, brass knuckles, all that good stuff.
Okay, yeah. Um, that's a good resource for that actually, because I was just thinking about that. Another thing too, I kind of wanted to pick your brain about is like being in the whole Minuteman community space. A lot of people are looking for like utilitarian stuff, like something to throw in your kit and go do whatever with. I think a lot of times when people think of blades in that aspect, because a lot of people just go back to like the military space whenever they're looking at gear and kit, they go towards like the bayonet or the utility knife, right? And kind of wanted to,
Yes.
get your opinion on, like some of the popular ones I can think of off the top of my head are like the M16 bayonet, the AK bayonet, the Glock knife, kind of these ubiquitous knives, very easy to find them. They're relatively inexpensive. A lot of people, I think, just assume that they're a good knife because, or like a K-bar, right? Because, oh,
Sure.
it was issued to this or that, the other, they've got some utility stuff to them. Like, would you, for someone maybe just wanting to just like, hey, I don't know what I'm going to need a knife for. Maybe I got to chop some stuff. Maybe I got to do whatever. Would you say that that's a good way to go, or would you kind of advise to go against that? Or what are your thoughts on
I'll
that?
be completely honest with you. Most of those blades were kind of designed with a hidden hilt. Okay, so they weren't designed to be beat on. They weren't designed to really um, do anything other than pierce. Okay, so when they're used
Thus,
as
them
such,
bayonet, right?
yeah, hence
Basically,
hence the bayonet, right? So I have heard some stories, and I've seen some videos here and there where people have had some good luck with some older K-bar models and that kind of thing. But I'll be honest with you, I don't suggest any of those like hidden tang knives. They're just not made to be beaten down like that. If you want something that is kind of hardy, that can be used long term. If you wanted to, use outdoors, what have you, you want something that has a full tang. Um, Absolutely want a full tang, especially if you're going to be potentially using it, to uh, you know, hammer down, possibly split wood with, you know, um, if it's a bushcrafter type knife, something along those lines. Now, one of the things that I have a personal vendetta against Chris Reeve for is that he has yet to release enough of his bushcrafter knives out into the community so that I could perhaps get my hands on one, um, which hurts my feelings slightly. Because I will say that is the one knife that is at a reasonable price point in his catalog. Um, Last I looked, prior to his announcement of the price hike, they were like $350. But then
whew,
he announced, and by he, I mean Tim Reed, announced to the people that had pending orders that they would be experiencing a bit of a price hike due to material costs. So I don't know what the current cost on those is, to be honest with you. But if you want something full tang and you could get your hands on something, those are pretty cool. I'll tell you my personal favorite, as far as one of those military style knives that people think are iconic and neat, is his Green Beret or his Pacific. Those are just really neat knives, right? And I've seen
yeah,
people beat the crap out of those. Those are made out of S35. If you're into that kind of military bayonet look, you know, tactical knife, I will say there's nothing that looks more like the ultimate Rambo knife than the Chris Reeve Pacific.
Yeah, I think that they have a little bit of an appeal of like again, it's kind of like how a milsurp would that you've got the military history side to it. They're kind of a vibe, and again, like you said, while they are designed mainly to be turn your gun into a spear and be stabby boys, that a lot of people just assume that oh, well, it's military issue, you must be able to beat the crap out of it. Where you and I both know that that's not entirely the case all the time. Um, but with that too, one thing I kind of want to pick your brain about is another like kind of ubiquitous knife that you see a lot of times is like the Mora knife, right? $10, you get them at Walmart. They're super sharp. I don't really know anyone who's got a lot bad to say about them. Like, what do you what do you think about that?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't had a whole lot of experience with them. I've seen people that speak pretty highly of them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen people on YouTube that speak pretty highly of them. Um, but I've never used one personally. They're $17 though.
Oh
Like
man,
at most places, like
they've
you
gone up in
really,
price.
yeah. I mean, like
Like I remember
that's
used to go down to Walmart in the camping section and camping section, or like by the knife area where the guns are back in the Walmarts when they still sold guns on them, and you could find those for $10 all day long. Like Grandpa would go and get those as Christmas presents for all the boys. Here's a more knife. Go do something with it.
no. I mean, it's like as quintessential as the old timer. You don't even know what blade steel it is because it just says carbon steel. It just says CS on the blade, right?
Yeah,
Um, and the thing is, I've had so many knives like that over the years that I have taken out into the woods and just beaten the crap out of and had so much fun with. Um, those are great knives to have. Um, there is absolutely a place for having that knife that you can hand off to anybody and not worry about anything happening to it.
I think the cool thing about it too is like because it's so cheap. Like one, it's cheap and it works pretty well, at least from my experience, right? But because it's so cheap, you can get away with like learning stuff or learning how to do things on it and not feel bad about it. Like one of the things I did one time is I watched the on YouTube how they do like the have you ever seen like the mustard and vinegar patina you can do onto knives? Like the poor
Yes.
man's patina. Like tried it out one day, right? Like one, it looks pretty cool now that it's been done, and two, assuming that the guy knew what he's talking about, assuming I didn't screw something up, in theory, it's better rust protected or something now. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, like, uh, suppose it was something a quick little fun thing to do, and it's something that I didn't feel bad doing it on the cheap knife because it was a more knife that was dirt cheap versus doing it on something that maybe I spent $500 on and being like, oh great, So
Oh no,
I think that's a cool.
100%.
I think that's the kind of the cool thing about there, and like you said, like you can go out and buy 10 of them and just have them. Like oh hey, you need a knife? Here you go. And I've seen people that they come in their little like rubberized uh plastic sheath or whatever, and I've seen people make like fire starter kits wrapped around it, all kinds of stuff. And that was just one thing I was just thinking about with that was the more knives seem to be kind of like this weird standout to where generally cheap knives don't, at least in my experience, don't hold up well. Like either the blade dulls really quickly or something breaks or they're just not that great. But like Mora knife is like this weird outsider for me, at least from my experience, that it's like, why do you not suck?
No, absolutely. Um, I'm trying to think. The favorite knife that I always had was this Kershaw that I had in basic training that I'm pretty sure got stolen, as a matter of fact. Um, but straight up, I think the thing was like $40. Of course, in the little shopette that they let you buy crap in. Um, but to be honest with you, I have no idea what it was made out of. No idea what the specifications were. But I mean, 9 times out of 10, all you're using it for is opening MREs and prying crap open,
Yeah.
scraping carbon off your bolt carrier. You know, things happen to those knives, and they're great. And that's why I like them. That was one of the things that I always enjoyed about working in retail and specifically retail and sports and outdoors. We used to always get a lot of stuff on clearance. We could get knives for super cheap all the time. And granted, they weren't always anything super great, but I mean, hey, cheap Gerber or something like that, hey, I'll use it eventually.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for that too, is like when it comes to something you want to trust your life with, and absolutely you want to get quality stuff. But I think that sometimes like the benefit of just having like a cheap, crappy knife is the fact that you can beat the crap out of it. You're not gonna feel bad about it. Like for example, scraping the carbon off of your bolt carrier, or, oh crap, I need to like pry this thing open. You're like, oh, broke my gas station knife. Oh well. You know what I mean? Like, oh, the little cheap Gerber like parachute knife that's like $20 or whatever, right? It's like, oh darn, you know, I busted it. Oh well, like you don't feel bad about that. Whereas, like, I can tell you right now, if I spent $400 on a knife and I'm doing something and that thing snaps or breaks or something happens to it, I'm gonna be pissed.
I'm a little more attached to it, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, there's a little more care that I take with a couple of my knives, and I've even noticed it with myself, and I'm being like, hey man, you need to chill the hell out. It's a tool.
Do you ever find yourself like picking up like go to do like going to get something and you're like, oh, but I don't want to use that one. That's my expensive knife. It's like the whole reason you bought it was to use it, but you're like, ah, but I don't want to use that one because what if then I'm out an expensive knife?
I 100% picked up one knife and then picked up another one day and like almost wanted to slap my hand. I felt really bad.
I I have I have one pair of Cry Precision pants, and they were we'll call it a gift from the Navy. Uh
Ah,
they're yeah, yeah, we were going out getting ready to go on deployment, and somebody happened to find a large quantity of these. Anyway,
sure.
whenever we go out to go do something, it's like I was just thinking about the knife like this. I'll be sitting there and I'll be like, because I only have the one pair, right? And that thought process in my mind is like, oh, wear the cry pants. And then I'm like, oh, but no, don't wear the cry pants, because if you get a hole in them or something, like you're out cry pants. But the whole reason you have the cry pants is to wear them to do this very specific thing, but you don't want to wear them to do the specific thing because you don't want to break them.
And that, that's where you just kind of got to grit your teeth and be like, you know what? At some point, the scratches on it are hopefully going to look cooler. And, I always look at like any of the old knives and stuff that my great grandfather had. I think probably my interest in blades came from my grandfather and my great grandfather. They were both butchers at one point in their life. They spent a lot of time cutting meat, and that was one of the things that they taught me as a young man is how to cut meat properly. And my great grandfather always carried a very thin boning knife in his back pocket. And every time I see a really thin, I guess what most people would refer to as a uh, fish and bird or a bird
Mm-hmm.
and trout knife, I think of
Yeah.
him. So that's where I kind of get that inspiration for liking that type of blade, that type of thing. But um, no, they always used them hard. Put them up wet, put them up dirty, and quite frankly, the scratches looked even cooler. I always compare it to the shotgun my great grandfather brought back from Belgium. You know, it's been fired probably, I don't know, I can't even count, several thousands of times, but it's one of those antique pieces. It's engraved. It's a Belgian FN Browning. This was not a shotgun that was meant to be shot like that, but he bought it and he said, "Damn well, I'm going to shoot it."
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just thinking about that. You know, I think that for a lot of people, um, you know, the idea of, you know, the old kind of ivory handled buck knife, or not ivory, but kind of like the wood and ivory look to it, with the buck knife that folds out when you got one pointed blade, one rounded blade. That, at least for me, like that's like ubiquitous with grandpa, you know. And
Yeah.
my grandfather always had one of those little buck knives in his pocket, and I came across one a while back, and I don't remember how I got it, but it wasn't his, but I don't remember how I got it. But every time I'm like, that's what it reminds me of, you know. And I think that's a certain thing too, that just like guns, there are certain things like that that are kind of heirlooms that get handed down. And you know, just like how you said, you got your first knife when you were 4. I feel like for a lot of us, that's almost like a rite of passage as a man, as a boy. Well, voice cracked there. As a man or as a boy, you know, like I still remember, like, you know, when my grandfather for Christmas gave me a Swiss Army knife, you know, and it was like a sign of, you know, I remember him saying like, hey, you know, look, you got to be responsible with this. If I see you messing around or hurting yourself or doing something stupid with it, like I'm gonna take it away, you know. And it was like, oh wow, this is serious. Like I have a tool now, you know, like I can do things. And it's I think that's kind of where it starts with a lot of us, you know, and then it goes up from there. But I know, like with my son, I have a like a little multi-tool, like a little SOG multi-tool. And that was the thing, because he kept being like, "Oh, Dad, I want a knife. I want a knife." And I was like, "All right, well, tell you what, I'm gonna give you this to start off with, and you know, you can help me around the house with it. It's got pliers, screwdriver, little knife blade, whatever on it. But you know, it's one of those things where it's like, look, if you can show me you can be responsible with this and not like just go around stabbing your sister on playing around or whatever, then cool, we'll move from there. But let's start with here, and show me that, you know, you could be responsible, and you know, do, you know, and handle some kind of level of responsibility that has a little bit of you know, potential for harm behind it. And then if you can handle that, we'll move on to something else."
No, absolutely, and I think you're exactly right. I think that's kind of where my dad started me. It was one of those deals where, you know, you sort of, you give a kid just enough rope so they can hang themselves, so to speak. I know that's kind of a dark image,
No,
so to speak,
I know what you
but
mean. I know what you mean.
but
That one's in a out of
uh,
context, and then I'm going to get canceled.
yeah, no, 100%. That is, I say the worst things, but
That's all good.
the uh, the point is, you know, my dad wanted to see, you know, just how responsible I could be with something even as small as that. And I remember the first time I cut myself, you know, granted, it was probably, I believe, the first or second day I had it. I didn't want to tell him about it. I remember trying to hide it, and I had cut my thumb and I had just slashed it, right? So I, of course, go to the bathroom, try to put some toilet paper on it, wash it out. And finally, I go show him. And my dad, being the nurse, looks at me and goes, "Well, do I need to put stitches in it?" And I said, "I don't think so." And he goes, "Okay, well, you'll be all right." You know, and it was just that understanding of, hey, I fessed up to that. It was almost it was a learning thing, you know, and it was a part of growing up. So that's a good memory.
Yeah, you know, I think that definitely plays a role into it, for sure. To where, you know, it's more than just a tool, and it is one of those things you think that, you know, you can pass it down, you can start something, you can start those ideas of like it opens up new doorways in that regard, you know. Like giving that knife to your kid, you're like, okay, cool. now come here and help me out with this thing. You know, and you could teach a skill set with that, or like, hey, you know, something simple like, hey, whittle this stick to a point, or like, hey, come help me do this with that, and you know, this with this, and it helps start those things, which I think is kind of a cool aspect of it. But as we're kind of wrapping up here, if you could give us maybe like top three knives in theory, like maybe your three favorite or like top three, and maybe try to do it of something that's like, you know, in that kind of like Spyderco-ish range, and then maybe you know, something a little bit higher end, and then like, you know, if you could only have one knife ever in the whole world, what would it be, kind of thing, if you can narrow it down to three.
That's tough. Okay, so top three knives. If I could have only three, well, I gotta say, I'm a huge fan of Spyderco, and I'm a huge fan of Benchmade. But I gotta say, recently, I got to put my hands on a friend of mine's Benchmade full immunity, and I kind of want one. So, as of right now, I'm gonna say, currently as a folding option, because I typically don't go for folders, I'm going to say a Benchmade full immunity.
Okay.
I'm going to say a, if I could only pick one, it would definitely be a dagger and knot Nomad, because I'm kind of attached to this one that I have at the hip always. And then Dream Knife. This one is a tough one.
Like, money's not an option, you know, like money's not a concern. Option. All right, money's not a concern.
But if money's no concern, I'm gonna give Big Chris over at Big Chris Customs a call, and see if his books are open, and see what I can get in there. But as of right now, I know his books are not open, because he is one of the premier knife makers in the industry. If you're not familiar with Big Chris Customs, I highly suggest you go on to YouTube. Just look up Big Chris. You're going to see a video of probably Blade Wars. This is when he was doing some custom knives and some competition cutting, and he's a big guy in an orange shirt, and he's just going to hell on this rope and on this board, but it's pretty awesome. He also has a podcast on YouTube where he talks a little bit about his knife making process, how he got started, all that good stuff. But if you want to find him on Instagram, he does have an Instagram, Big Chris Customs. But in my opinion, as far as if money was no option, that's who I'd be buying knives from constantly.
Sweet. Well, I think that that about wraps up, I think, like our conversation on knives, at least for now. I think I'd love to have you on again in the future and kind of discuss this a little bit further, kind of maybe getting more into the weeds on a few things. But I really appreciate you taking the time, coming down to, you know, sit down with me and kind of talk about, you know, the knifey knives. And yeah, man, thanks for coming on.
No, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And I know we did get to talk for too long, didn't get in the weeds about a lot, but love to be back on if you'd have me. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely, man. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for, like, I know I learned a lot. I hope you guys listening learned a lot. And with that said, we will catch you on the next one.